So take us through your story from, I've researched you a lot now, so I know you have a pretty turbulent upbringing, and maybe you can take us through some pieces of that and all the way up through your divorce that caused a bit of the awakening for you and led you to who you are now and how you're embodying your work that you're doing now and serving others with now.
Yeah, so for me, this all really began around the time of birth because I was born to a mom who was struggling with mental illness. She had endured a lot of trauma and abuse on her side. And so she had me when she was 22 years old and really had not had a chance to recover even the slightest from her own childhood. And so my earliest years, even in the first year of my life, there was a lot of time spent alone, a lot of time spent lacking nurturance and care. And at about 3 years old, my mom dropped me off at a foster home because she wanted to go and try to heal and get better. But at the time, I had really no understanding of that. And she didn't really say anything. We just kind of got in the car and I got dropped off. And that was sort of the first peak of my abandonment wound, even though there were earlier instances of that. And then throughout my childhood, there was a lot of, instances where there was either sexual abuse or abandonment or just general emotional neglect. Even though my mom loved me, she couldn't be there for me because she couldn't be there for herself. And she really struggled to just cope in her own mind. And so that was quite turbulent and challenging. And I think it was about around age 12 where I began running with street kids and drinking a lot. And, sorry, this is crackling.
Oh, no. We didn't hear anything.
Oh, I think we might be having a battery issue.
You want to switch it out now? That's fine. We couldn't hear it, but if you hear it on your side, for sure.
Yeah, just let me check it because
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I think I'm going to need to change these batteries. Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
I'm going to pause it.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. Technical difficulties all abound.
All good. Sorry for the stress of all of it.
Yeah, no, it's totally fine. I'm going to just unravel this cord because that might be what's causing the static.
All good. I will say I'm very impressed by the color coding of the books behind you.
Soul's favorite toy right now is this fake thumb.
Oh, what the hell?
I know. It's so weird.
Boys.
I just found it next to me.
Body parts.
Yeah.
All right. How do you want to do this? Do you want me to just start over? That was kind of choppy anyways. I can just kind of start from the top.
Yeah,
What do you prefer?
So we're just taking us through your story and getting us to who you are now and the work you're doing now, how that all came to be.
Okay. I'll just start over.
Cool.
So I was born to a mentally ill mom who had me at about 22, and she had endured a lot of childhood trauma. Some of the things that she endured, I just can't even believe that she's alive today. Mm-hmm. And so growing up with her, it was really very much like growing up with somebody who was just trying to survive and just trying to get through the day, which of course as a baby and as a toddler, you don't understand that at all. But there was a lot of alcoholism and emotional neglect, and I spent a lot of time alone before the age of 3. I can remember being alone almost every night, sometimes for weeks. Wow. And it was like a really intense time. But as we know, when we grow up in environments like that, we don't know the difference. And I can just remember, my mom coming home drunk and breaking things or hitting walls and falling asleep in the bathroom and me tucking her in and brushing her teeth. And I'm just really always wanting to take care of her. And I was often worried about her. And this was, just 3 years old. And then one day she picked me up and took me to a home and dropped me off. And this was a foster home, which I had been dropped off at, but I wasn't aware of that. So I just remember kicking and screaming and wanting her to come back, and she didn't come back. And that was when she really wanted to go and get clean. But that was also the point of abandonment wound city for me. It was just like everything kind of formed around my heart, walls formed around my heart, and I really didn't feel safe in the world. And that was sort of my childhood. That was my whole childhood, on and off, being dropped off at foster homes or being abandoned in some way, and also really not feeling safe to express myself because there wasn't an emotional theme of safety or security in my life because my mom had never had that either. And what I've later learned is that when you have children at a specific age that you experienced trauma, your child will begin to trigger you. And so that's sort of what happened with us, which, you know, we've processed a bit now. But essentially, I just hit a certain age and it was just too much for her. It was too much of a mirror and just brought everything up. So around the age of 12, I started running with street kids, and I started drinking a lot and smoking and like sleeping outside and just hanging with, you know, the worst of the worst crowd, I guess you could say, people who were, you know, anywhere from 5 to 10 years older than me. And that's about the same time where I became what they call like ward of the government. So the government took custody of me. And again, that was a really deep moment of abandonment for me, given all the circumstances around it. And then at age 14, my mom moved away. She moved to a different province. And from that point on, I went to a couple more foster homes, and then I moved out on my own when I was 16. And I was so done. I was like, I'm done with the system. I'm done, you know, being told what to do. I'm done being controlled, because that's really how it felt for me. And I'm just doing this on my own. And so I worked 2 jobs and I homeschooled myself. And by the time I was 19, I felt ready to like build a life. I was, you know, not drinking anymore really. And I started to seek more. And that's when I met somebody who seemed like a good ticket out of the life I was in. And so I moved right away in with him, like 2 months. Total trauma bond. Was very, very exciting. Total passion, lust, all of the things. And right away he became abusive. And it just got worse and worse. And because of my upbringing, I learned to be responsible for others and to take care of people who were sick or who harmed me. And because of my upbringing, I also didn't have a baseline for what healthy love looked like. And so for me, that was normal in some way. Even though I knew that the physical violence was absolutely not normal and not okay, it was almost like I had been in a bubble my whole life. And so it didn't feel easy to get out. And so I spent about a year in that relationship. And there was a moment where he had attacked me, and I had made it to the bathroom, and I locked myself in the bathroom. And I looked in the mirror, and my whole face was bruised and swollen, and I hardly recognized myself. I had never seen myself that way. And then all of a sudden, I just had this flash, and it was as if this message was being poured into me, and it just said, this is a part of your path, this is a part of your purpose. You're going to speak on stage to women, you're going to help women who have been through domestic violence, and you're going to help women get through these types of things. And it really hit me hard. And I actually even told him that when we were driving in a car. I said, you know, I had this vision essentially that this is going to be something that I talk about one day. And I really think that you should get help, because I'm going to work on this stuff. And so I left him finally. And then eventually I started to build a life of my own. And I moved to Vancouver, where I live now today. And yeah, and then I met another guy after I think I did about a year of celibacy. And I don't think it was conscious tantric celibacy. It was just like, I'm not having sex and I'm not dating, which, you know, there's many more layers to real true celibacy. But I did that. And then I had made all of these beautiful friends, and I was, you know, playing with crystals and studying chakras. And I felt like I was like really on the spiritual healing path. And so I met someone who, he seemed really nice, and he was really into spirituality, and we were like 21. And so we started dating, and it was very much the most healing relationship I've ever been in terms of waking me up to my own internal BS, because we had this strange relationship where we both sort of didn't want to be fully in it. And I especially didn't. He was always trying to get me to do work in the relationship, and I was always hesitant. Like I didn't want to be with him. And even when we got married, which was, you know, he was from another country, and we're like, let's try to make this work. Even then it was like, I don't really see myself with you, but for some reason I just had to be in it. I just had to be in it. And I can remember one night staring up at my ceiling and thinking, gosh, this is codependent thinking. I'm responsible for this guy. Like, what would he do without me? I really hope he just falls in love with somebody else because I don't want to take care of him anymore.
Wow.
And within a month, he did fall in love with someone else. It happened to be a friend of mine, not a super close friend, but enough to really hurt. And so my wish came true. And I was seriously shocked. It was the most painful thing I have ever felt. I was so devastated. I felt desperate for him to come back. And it was like all of these emotions and feelings that I hadn't let myself feel throughout my entire life came flooding in. And I can remember him leaving the last time, and I had gotten in a fight, and I just followed him out the house. And he got in the car with her and they just drove away, and I was barefoot and I was standing in the road watching them drive away. And I just had this flash of when I was 3, and I saw myself being ripped out of my mom's arms into these foster parents' arms. And I saw myself screaming and thrashing, and I felt that exact same way. And then I just got this message, like, this is not about him. And it seriously felt like a light bulb went off in my whole body, and I was flooded with relief. Like, even though it was so painful and I was so overwhelmed, I was like, thank God, it's not about him. This is about my old wounds and my childhood trauma, the things that I haven't ever let myself feel. That means that I can heal without him, and that I actually don't need him to come back or do anything. And it started to make sense for me why it hurt so bad, because here I am finally getting what I wanted, which was to break free of this dead end relationship. And yet when it happened, I was like begging for him to come back. And I felt crazy, like absolutely psycho. And I couldn't understand what the hell was happening to me. And it all fell together then. And so that's when I really dove deep. So then I started doing deep inner child work, deep transpersonal therapy, shadow work, plant medicines, like multiple ceremonies per week, like breath work, everything. I just went for it. And that is why I'm so grateful for him, even though there was so much betrayal and so many things that really didn't end well in that partnership. If that hadn't happened, I think I could have stayed asleep. And so people are like, oh, that's so horrible. Like, I can't believe he did that. And I can't believe he did that. And I'm like, yeah, you know what? Like, that was a gift. That was a real gift for me. So that's how it all started.
Yeah. Powerful. Our relationships are so powerful. And I love how you relate how your life has looked through that, because I think that that's something when we tell our story, we don't always think, or maybe our egos say we don't want to rest it so much on the different relationships we have, but really that is what makes us who we are. And not just romantic relationships, of course, but especially our earliest relationships with our parents or parental figures. So yeah, that's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing this.
Yeah, I found over a dozen similarities between my story and yours, but I love how you articulate it in a way that's like you're seeing the point of it all. And I think I tend to just talk about it in chronological order. This is exactly what happened, the end. So I love the way that you were able to put light in your story.
I think sometimes, Jade, it's hard for us to navigate our own stories without falling into the victimhood or the victim personality of this piece, and coming in and out of, because we know all these ties and emotions that come up when we relate it, especially when it's our darkest shadows. And we don't want to get sucked into that when we're just trying to tell the story, you know?
Yeah, that's true. So we hear the term wild woman being thrown around a lot these days. Can you put words to what a wild woman is?
It's interesting. I keep getting asked this. I'm like, am I the wild woman expert? Yeah. You know, what's funny is I wrote a piece on what it means to be a wild woman years ago. And it's like one of the posts that has gone crazy, like, I don't know, like 30 or 40,000 shares. I don't know.
Oh, wow.
And people really love it. And really the essence of it is that, you know, a wild woman can be trusted even though she's feared because she's honest. And I think there are some misconceptions and, you know, terms fly around these days. They get really trendy and then we lose the essence of them. And I think that if we're really tuning into the essence of what people are after when they hear that term, they're craving authenticity. And that's, I think, something that we all crave, and that's something that we all want, is authenticity, vulnerability, bravery, courage, and willingness to go deep. And I sort of see the wild woman as that. And I think that she kind of embodies all of the archetypes because she's courageous enough to allow herself to embody all of the archetypes within her rather than suppress or deny any of them. And so for me, that's sort of what she represents. She also represents a woman who is willing to, face her fears, face her shadow, and dive deep. And of course, nobody could say it better than Clarissa Pinkola Estes, who wrote Women Who Run with the Wolves. So if you want to dive in, go there.
Yeah, it's one of the best books just because her storytelling ability is so strong. And she sings to you if you get the audiobook, which I really like.
Oh, I have the hard copy. I'll have to get the audiobook.
And in that wild woman description, what I'm hearing is essentially it's a woman who has done this deep work, dug up the things that she really needs to look up that are some of her core wounds in order to put in alignment her life in a way that she can feel okay being authentic instead of living in that chaos of hiding behind a mask all the time, which I think we all it's like as soon as we join the culture we're born into, we're just gluing that mask to our face, and it's really hard to ever unstick that thing. It takes a lot of painful work, even though we're just basically doing the slow pain thing while we're wearing it, right? Like we're just sad that we aren't being able to be our real selves. So I'm so glad we're in this time where we can step into our wild women, our wild woman selves and really own that part of our persona. So, and your work is so much a part of that. So thank you for that. How would you describe a conscious relationship? And I know that's a huge question, but maybe we can get into that any way you want. And how do we create that in our lives is really what we want to know. So
yeah. That's it. I'm going to make it as simple as possible because it's my favorite thing to do is simplify this because really there's only one distinction between a conscious relationship and one that maybe is unconscious. And that is whether or not we are willing to take ownership for our minds and our shadows and our projections in relationship. So I can have a relationship with my husband where every time something triggers me, I blame it on him. I make it his fault. I make it somebody else's fault. I blame the relationship. I start to demonize him. I build a story of him in my mind. And then slowly over time, we erode. Or I can allow every moment when I feel triggered as an opportunity to explore my mind. What is this that's coming up in me again? Oh, maybe that's my coping mechanism, which is to run away. Maybe this is that part of me that always wants to push away love. Maybe this is that part of me that doesn't trust. Maybe this is that part of me that thinks I'm better off alone because that's all I ever knew. And then I can practice bringing that to him and really lean into love, lean into vulnerability, and practice conscious, mindful communication and really let myself be seen. Instead of, reacting in anger, I can say I'm scared or I'm feeling hurt. And that actually takes so much more courage than it does to react in anger. So conscious relationship really is deep personal work. And it's all about getting to know yourself on a deep level and sort of leaning into the fear rather than believing everything your mind tells you. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think that starts too with realizing that in relationship, it is a team, that this is about how do we help each other rise? Like, how do we help each other get to become better humans? Because sometimes we get into a pattern. I know I'm speaking for myself here, get into a pattern that feels like it's almost a competition with your romantic partner. It feels like you always have to be right. You always have to find, some way to have the upper hand. And especially, energetically, I've always kind of had that more of a masculine tended towards the more masculine, like stepping into those shoes. So that has been a big challenge for me. And I know probably a lot of people listening have a similar plight. So teammates, try to focus on that.
Well, and it's beautiful that you bring that up because we can only have a teammate if there's two people willing to be a teammate. And I think the reason why we don't feel like that is because if we grew up in an environment where we weren't a contributing member of the family and we were told that, we're living under someone else's roof and we'll do as we're told, or, we're forced to do things that we don't want to do. We're forced to eat food when we don't want to eat it. We're told that our emotions, some of them are acceptable and some of them aren't.
Right.
And it's incredibly challenging then to relate to others in a way that we feel like we are a peer or that we are a team member. And so our self-esteem is really shaped when we're young. And so many of us come into relationship looking to resolve those old wounds, but also seeing our partners as those people from our past. So we're projecting those ghost figures onto them. So in my previous relationship, the one that kind of woke me up, he really represented my mom, but it was all unconscious. And so we just projected our crap all over each other all the time, and neither of us took ownership for it. I still project my mom onto my husband, Ben, but the thing is that I'm aware of it, so we can actually sit down and process what's coming up, right? And so having a partner who's actually willing to see you and be on your team, that's the factor. So people are always asking, well, what do I do if my partner doesn't want to do the work? Or like, I'm trying so hard, but they're coming back at me with insults or name calling.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily going to work for you. You're not going to be able to change them and convince them to show up different.
What are those red flags that we might look for in a partner, or even like on a first date? Whatever it is, there's in the beginning of a relationship, or even if you're deep in a relationship, that could tend you to notice that might be a direction you don't want to go.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's so many, and aside from feeling your body and the energetics, which I think we have learned again to tune out, there's many, and I'll say a few that really come to my mind that I've noticed. And of course, there's lots of work out there that you could research if you really want to go deep into how to spot it. But one thing that always comes up for me is when I hear somebody speaking really negatively about their ex-partner and not taking any accountability or any responsibility. Like, that's really scary, because that means that in their mind, they didn't play a role in what happened. And regardless, I mean, I can see the role that I played in every single relationship, regardless of how badly the other person acted. It doesn't justify anything that they chose to do that's out of alignment. But I also know how I showed up and how I contributed. And so it kind of worries me when I hear somebody talking about their ex in a really demeaning way, rather than focusing on their own lessons. And then, of course, you can notice, like, how do you feel in their presence? Do you feel safe? Like, are they curious about you? Are they curious about anyone? Are they really just focused on talking about themselves all of the time? And how do they treat other people? How do they treat people who are being served, right? Like, are you at a restaurant and they're talking down to the server? I think all of those things, even though it might sound insignificant, you're getting to see who that person is. But the truth is that, if you're talking about someone who's like narcissistic or sociopathic, they can be the most charming people in the world. Like my ex, the abusive person I dated when I was 19, he was like the most charming individual you've ever met. Like, when I told people later what had happened, nobody believed me, because they said he was the nicest guy.
Right.
And actually, he was incredibly violent and incredibly sick. But because he saw that I was vulnerable and I was overzealous to just get out of my life, I was the perfect opportunity. And there was red flags along the way where I noticed him kind of slip out of his charm and into something that looked like aggression, or say something like really offside or rude, or I would just feel unsafe. But I ignored it, even though I knew that it was a red flag. And I even remember one time sitting on his couch, and I had this thought, oh my gosh, this guy's going to get abusive. And instead of leaving or not going deeper with this guy, I totally ignored it, and then I moved in with him, right?
Yeah.
And that's what we do sometimes. And so I feel like we may even be able to spot a red flag, but if our programming is to make exceptions for people, or to caretake them, or to try to fix them or prove our lovability, then that's what we got to work on. Yeah.
So because you brought up narcissism, and just this week, actually, we released an episode specifically on narcissistic personality disorder. So someone with extreme narcissism, something like you're speaking to in that abusive boyfriend, they, talked about NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, being something that is incurable, which is such a depressing thought. I don't know if it is for you, but just like that, you can't fix this thing, you can't do anything about it. And I think as women, when we're in an abusive relationship, we think that it's going to get better. We think we are going to be able to like be strong enough to help him get through whatever he's going through so that he won't do this anymore. What do you believe about someone with extreme narcissism, since you've been through that are your thoughts of that is incurable to some degree?
You know, I really couldn't speak on that because I haven't done any of that type of research. My focus has always really been on sort of the transpersonal and the more esoteric. But I will say that I have a suspicion that most people, even people who have, you know, the most severe form of narcissism, might be able to shift a little bit if they are given the right environment and the right support. And I think we're learning about the brain all of the time. So even when we think that something can't change, it's possible that it could.
Right.
But obviously, there are some things that can't be reversed or can't be cured. And I think that that's the danger, is when we start questioning that and thinking, well, maybe it is possible. Maybe I can change them. And I can relate because I did the same thing. I really wanted to fix this guy, and that just proved to be really unsafe. But I think what's important is that we realize that a lot of times all of these disorders and these things that we're seeing in our culture are based in a foundation of trauma. And so I wish that we would start talking more about why there are people out there that have turned on themselves and others. I'm watching, I do this really weird thing, which I guess I'll just share, is I watch a lot of crime documentaries. And I do it because I'm so fascinated by the backgrounds of people who, you know, are sort of what they call like a menace to society, or someone who's acted out. And it's really interesting. Almost all of them have severe childhood trauma. And so I wish that we would work on that more, because that's the base of it all.
I think luckily we are. That's why we're here on the show doing this work. So I don't know, of course we're surrounded by this a lot more than probably the rest of the population, because we chose to do this, but I think it's coming, you know, like I think we are taking the taboo around therapy and around doing shadow work and caring about, you know, self-love and all that. I think we're taking that stigma away little by little. So we'll just keep chipping away at that. But yeah, there's so much more. Of course, we could go in every direction with you. And regarding the narcissism piece, it's just, I wanted to just say that anyone listening, if you're in a situation like that, of course, getting out of it is probably your best bet. So I'm not trying to give you any idea that it is solvable. You shouldn't be trying to fix someone in the first place, because that's not really your place. So yeah, self-work, get out of there, and then be able to look at it with clear hindsight. So I've heard you speak on something you called front loading, which I don't know, you know, if this is something you have any expertise in, but the way you articulated it when you talked about it was something that I thought would be so beneficial to add into my own relationship when I'm in a very heated situation, which is usually like hormonally spurred, it seems, as I track, you know, here's when I'm being the biggest dick, and but when I can't seem to regulate my emotions, if I get triggered for whatever reason in relationship with my husband, being able to say to him, you know, front load, I think would be very beneficial. So maybe can you explain what that is and how that could work in a triggered conversation?
Yeah, I don't actually think, maybe we want to cut this part out, because I don't actually think that's my term.
Well, I don't think I don't know if it's your term. I just heard you talk about front loading as something you used with Ben before, as you were triggered or something, and you, instead of just responding or reacting, really, you said, I might be really reactive right now. Are you sure you can handle it? Okay.
Got it. Okay.
We'll get there. We'll cut that piece out.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So when I'm triggered, I have learned that I'm not a very nice person, and that anything that comes out of my mouth is going to be my ego trying to defend itself. And that is true for all of us. And so what I've learned to do, and what I usually suggest to others, is that when you're feeling triggered, it's best to call a timeout. And I mean, John and Julie Gottman, they talk about this all the time in their research. If your heart rate is high, you cannot respond in a way that is helpful. It's just not possible. And if we're in our trigger, then that means that our ego is terrified and it's going to come out and try to protect us. So, you know, Ben and I have a way of processing things, and we have certain dialogues that we follow. But something that I tend to say to him, you know, if I do need to vent and we're in a container where that's okay, is I'll say, hey, like, do you mind holding space for me for a few moments so that I can just get this out? But I need to warn you, like, I'm still quite triggered and I don't feel totally responsible for my mind yet. And I'm not really able to take full ownership. So I need time to get there. Now, of course, I don't always do this. And most of the time I end up processing on my own, because it's just my way of kind of getting it sort it out first. But when we can do that, sometimes what I notice is that as I'm sort of venting to him, and I might start out kind of projecty and blamey, that I will quickly start to catch myself and start to see the projection and see how I'm making him responsible for something in my history. And I'll often even tie it back to some incident and have this really realization moment where I'm like, oh wow, this is totally about that one time, you know, when I was this age and this happened to me and I felt this way and it's coming up again. And then we can talk about that, and then we can have a really healing conversation rather than me just blaming him or projecting on him. So generally now what we do is we try to just take time out before we talk. Like, we don't have a lot of those conversations anymore because I feel like it's not that useful, and we want to really create an environment of positivity in our lives, and we don't really want to be, you know, going at it while we're both really triggered. But sometimes that can really help, and then we follow like a clearing process. And so we've worked with the Gottmans and with Harville and Helen Hendricks and follow these dialogue processes where you stay really tightly actually within a script. Like, you're not allowed to veer off of it. And it really changes things because you can't blame and you can't judge and you can't criticize and you can't project really unless you're projecting within the script, which is like designed to usher you to a moment of realization.
Wow.
And so we've really learned to use our tools, because we used to have the tools but not use them, and then our fights were like so childish and honestly just not enjoyable.
Where can people find those dialogues?
So the Gottman Institute could be a good resource. There are some, I think they have some free, and then you can take their workshops. And then Harville and Helen Hendricks, you could read the book Getting the Love You Want.
It's the best book I recommend that more than any other book.
Yeah.
That one's good. Yeah.
We just went and worked with them up at Esalen in a couple of months ago, and we're going to be going and working with them again sometime in the next couple of months. And their work is amazing. And Ben and I are also working with couples now as well, just sort of on the side when we have a bit of extra time. And so we also support couples in just learning basic dialogue processes and learning how to fight clean, because it's really a game changer, and it's going to make the world of difference if you know how to fight fair.
Again, just remembering you're on the same team.
Yeah. I wanted to go into shadow work with you. Could you explain what shadow work is?
Yeah, so shadow work is essentially the aspect of looking at our minds, looking at the darker sides of our personality, maybe like the parts of us that are angry and jealous and hateful and aggressive and mean and whatever, you know, that is inside of you. We all have something. We all have all of it, really. And it's really not about extraction, and it's not about really changing ourselves so much as it is about acceptance. So when we work with people in our programs, we're like, hey, you're not here to become a completely different person. You're not here to extract the qualities that you don't believe are good enough, or that you think are wrong, or that you think make you a bad person. We're here to shine a light on those things and take a real good look, understand their function, thank them for being there, and welcome them, and give them a seat at the table, but not at the head table, right? And so what happens when we allow ourselves to have anger, we allow ourselves to have jealousy, we allow ourselves to even feel hatred sometimes in our bodies, if that's what's passing through us, without shame, without guilt, without repression, is that it doesn't build the same way. It's kind of like putting a lid on a pressure cooker and then it just like blows off because there's no way to express it. So shadow work is really about accepting that, hey, as a human being, I do have a full spectrum of emotions. And sometimes those emotions can be pretty intense and pretty dark, and they're not all super nice and fluffy. And that's totally okay. Because if I can own that, then I don't need to project it out on the world. And so I see the world in a way that is a reflection of what's going on inside of me. And so if I've got a lot of bottled up anger and a lot of bottled up resentment, it's going to be really hard for me to see connection, for me to see friendship, for me to trust love. I'm probably going to be yelling at everybody in my car, right? I'm going to be pretty angry all the time, and it's going to come out in all sorts of ways that don't serve me. Whereas if it's integrated, I might be able to own that anger in a way that I can use it as a tool to express myself more. Like I might fuel it into dance, or I might fuel it into sex, or I might fuel it into screaming into a pillow, or doing breath work, or journaling, some way that I can own it. And that is why we do shadow work, is just so we can become more whole.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. I wanted to ask, I use these terms in language sometimes with my husband, who is understanding it now, but I'm just not articulate about getting these points across. So reactive versus responsive, maybe you can describe, when you use those two terms in this language of how you're having conscious relationship, what do we mean?
Totally. That's a good one, because when we react to something, we're often reacting to a story that our minds made up. So when I'm in a fight with Ben and he does something that I think is just so rude, my story is going to be that he did that on purpose, that he knows damn well what he did, and he is just being ignorant. That's the story. That's where my ego comes in and pushes him away. But if I respond, I'm going to get curious. And instead of jumping to conclusions and assuming the worst, I love to assume the best. So chances are there's a good reason why he did that, or there's a good reason why he said that, or something else entirely was going through his mind, and I wonder what that might be. So to me, responding is about curiosity, and it's about taking a moment to see what's really happening and what's really present in the space. Reacting is sort of coming from ego, it's coming from defensiveness, and it leaves very little room for connection.
Yes.
You said if it's not true, it shouldn't be triggering. Could you go into that some? For some reason, it's hard for me to understand.
Yeah, these are some of the deeper concepts that, we start to work with when we're in shadow work containers. And there's a few things that I want to say. First of all, there's no absolutism in any of the things that, we study or that we write, especially with these like esoteric practices and principles. You have to remember that there's a lot of time deep metaphor in it. But when it comes to speaking about, if it's not true, then it shouldn't trigger you. That is sort of referring to when somebody else is coming at you with a judgment or at you with a projection. It's not really like that's always true across the board. But if somebody comes to me and they make a judgment of me, and it's not true, and I'm confident within myself, then chances are, yeah, it might irritate me a little bit. I might be like, okay, well, screw that guy for saying that. But I'm not going to spin out over it. I'm not going to go trail off in my mind and get extremely defensive and then strategize all the ways that he's wrong and how to prove him wrong. I'm going to just accept that that's their judgment. And so oftentimes what happens when we get really triggered by something, it's because it's tapping on a wound, tapping on something that is true for us, something that feels a little bit too close to home, right? And so that's where, when we get triggered, we can really look at, what does this represent for me? Does this character flaw that I see in this other person that just drives me absolutely crazy remind me of sometimes how I can do that? Do I think they're oversensitive because I actually feel so much shame at how sensitive I am? That kind of thing.
Yeah. I thought of an example, like the first time when I first started to realize what triggers were, when I first started to do shadow work, I would get so heated if I was catcalled. And I turned it into this thing of like, it's disrespectful to women and I care about other women. But really it was because I felt deep down inside that all of my jobs were image-based. And so I felt like that was all I had to offer. So whenever someone would catcall me or say something about my body, like a stranger walking by, it would really trigger me. And so I don't know if that example helps anybody, but.
Well, I understand what you're saying, Sheleana, is that essentially all behaviors tend to be a response to our belief systems or our fears or our anxieties. And that makes me think of the example of when you recognize anything, when you basically see something terrible in someone, it's because it lives in you as well, right? So I think of like right now in the we're going into this new voting year and everyone's red flags are going up everywhere. There's anxieties going up everywhere. There's fear going up everywhere. So people are shooting on everybody. People are hating on everybody and having all this segregation happen. But the things that they're pointing out in their opposing, party are things that if they look deep enough are triggering to them because there's something internal happening. So I think that's maybe an example that might be, I don't know, for me, I can visualize it with the voting world and Trump and everybody, up in arms. So.
Since this all does, go ahead. Sorry.
I think the example that you gave, Jade, it made sense to me too, because on one hand, my mind goes, oh, well, that actually makes a lot of sense that you would be upset about that, because it feels violating and it's actually somebody's crossing your energetic boundaries and that's not okay. And this is where we get confused, where we think, oh, well, if I'm triggered by it, then that means that it's also okay. That's not true. Just because you're triggered by it doesn't mean that you're not allowed to have a boundary about that.
Thank you for saying that. That's a good point.
Feel like, hey, this isn't okay. Nobody has a right to make a comment about your body or catcall you. However, if you find yourself really, really triggered by it, you did the right thing by inquiring, okay, what is it inside of me that is feeling so worked up about this and so upset? And you realized, oh, wow, like this is really tapping on that belief that I have that I'm just a body, right? And so this is how we sort of use these opportunities as a way to know ourselves better. And so that doesn't mean that when that happens in the future, you're not still going to be like,
right,
that's not okay. It's just that it won't impact you in such a way that it takes you down.
Exactly.
Because you're like, okay, this is going to bring up that part of me that thinks I'm just a body. And I know that that's not true.
Yeah. And I know that all of this has so much to do with our inner child. So how can we tap into our inner child?
I love this question because inner child work is my fave. You could download my meditation. I did a free inner child meditation, which is basically just a recording of how I work with my own inner child and how I've done my own inner child work for a long time, which is visualization. So my husband and I, when we first got together, once we started having fights, which was like 6 months in, and then I think a year and a half in, we started to get into the power struggle. All of our stuff started to come up. And we kind of got in this push-pull dynamic where, you know, we would have a fight and then we weren't using our dialogue tools at that point. And so he would move away from me and I would just keep leaning into his space and kind of like try to sort of bulldoze his energy and want him to respond a certain way. And I would label him as the avoidant because he needed space. And so over time, we did this dance for a while and it got really exhausting. And I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. It doesn't feel good for me. I want to stop this pattern. And I realized that the whole time I had been blaming him for it because I would be ready to work things out or I would want to talk about it. But in that, I was also wanting to analyze him and like fix him and tell him all the ways that he was projecting instead of taking ownership for my own stuff. And so one day I realized, oh, wow, I'm still not taking ownership. I'm still making it about him. So I let him go. I just said, you know, the next time we have a conflict, if you don't want to lean in, if you don't want to talk about it, if you need space, I'm just going to let you. If you don't want to hold space for me, you don't have to. I'm going to go and feel my feelings. And so the first time that it happened, I said, can you hold space for me right now? And he said, no. And I said, okay. And so I went into the other room and I laid on my bed and I put a hand on my heart and a hand on my belly and I just breathed and I just cried and I just visualized my inner child, my little girl when she was like 3 years old. And it was so dark and it was so black and she was so scared. And I just said, you know, I'm here for you. I love you. You're safe. You're not alone. It's okay to feel this stuff. You're not crazy for having big emotions. It's okay. And I just did that and I just moved the energy. We call it moving the energy when we're letting our emotions flow through us. And then I felt okay again and I felt really empowered. And as I did that more, he started to feel safe to come towards me because I was no longer coming at him with this intense energy that he needed to do something or to like save me from my emotions. And that's actually what shifted the pattern. And so I did that inner child work every single time I felt triggered or upset or sad or scared. And I just really built that relationship where I was allowed to feel and I didn't need anyone's permission. I didn't need anyone to save me. And that's a really beautiful gift that we can give ourselves and learning to self-soothe.
That's really good. It kind of has to do with inner child, but can you also touch on mother wounds and how the way a man relates to his mother will maybe go into play with how he relates to you?
Yeah, this is sort of how all relationship works, right? Like our relationship to our parents for all of us, not just men, is going to come into our relationships with our romantic partners and sometimes even really close friends. You know, my co-facilitator Heather and I, we've done a ton of mother work together because we both trigger each other's mother wounds like crazy. And
wow.
It's not just with, you know, romantic partners or with men. And so the interesting thing is that, you know, in the Imago system, which is, you know, the Harville Hendricks model that they've developed,
so good.
There's a lot of dialogue around talking about our history with our parents and then seeing how we tend to attract people into our lives who do mirror some of those negative traits in our parents. And that's because unconsciously we really want to close the loop and we want to heal it.
Right.
And so what I have noticed is that when we have an unhealed relationship with a parent and we haven't done the work to heal it in our minds, we might not be able to heal with them. That might not be possible. But if we haven't done any of that exploration, chances are that we're not going to be aware of how we're projecting that pain or that anger or that resentment onto our partners. And that takes sometimes a lifetime of work. Like Ben and I are still doing that work together, right? Because I have a lot of that in my history. And so there are still wounds in me where I don't fully trust or when I don't fully feel safe. But what I find is that because our culture has sort of become very rigid in the ways that it sees, you know, masculinity and femininity, men more than ever now don't feel safe to show their emotions. They're actually neglected more. It's proven statistically that boys are more neglected emotionally by their parents than girls are. And so then they come into a relationship and they just don't know how to relate in the ways that we want them to. And so then they can, you know, bring their anger at their mother or their resentment at their mother or their fear of being controlled to the relationship and really project that. And Ben and I talk openly about how that happens in our marriage sometimes, like how he projects that I'm trying to control him or whatever, when really that's not my intention. But the flip side of it is that, you know, he owns it. And then I also, sometimes I am trying to control. And that's where it gets juicy. Is like, can we just own that? That like sometimes that's going to come up and it's okay, but can we own it? Can we be with that too? Yeah.
I think that's another, we said red flags before. Another big red flag is if they may not be completely healed from their trauma with their parents, but if they, like I had an ex that in the very beginning, I heard him like cuss out his mom. So I should have, that was a big red flag. And I, like you said, it didn't make me feel safe and I ignored it. But I always find that if a man or a woman, if they talk down to their mother or father or like cuss at them and call them names, then that shows a lot of trauma that is going to come out at you.
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, that is such a good one because it really just represents what's going to come up in your relationship. If there's that unresolved anger, then we're no longer dealing in those moments. We're no longer dealing with the adult self. We're dealing with the wounded child. And the wounded child is very entitled and they think it's all about them. And they just want what they want and they have demands and they have needs to be met. And it's really this self-centered space. And so if we know that we're in relationship with somebody who has not dealt with any of those wounds, then really we're signing up to be in relationship with wounded inner child. And so we, by, you know, just by being with them, we automatically become that figure for them. And that goes the other way around, right? If we're not healed and we go into relationship, we're going to expect our partners to meet our needs to excess, to the point where it's not healthy anymore. And so we really have to watch for that.
Yeah. What are the levels of the mind that you talk about in your program?
Yeah, so there's levels and stages of awakening, levels of consciousness. And the first level is sort of like blissful ignorance. Right. And so kind of just floating around, we're just blissfully unaware of how we play a role in anything. And then the next stage is that we start to get irritated by everything around us and we start to feel angry, but it looks like it's all happening outside of us. And so everything is external at this point. And we keep bumping into that wall until we get to the third stage, which is the mirror, which is where we start to see that, oh, wow, I keep coming up against this pattern over and over again, and I'm hitting a wall. So I can either hit that wall and I can go back to square one, which is to just be blissfully unaware and not take any accountability for anything. Right. Or I can look a little bit deeper and in that wall, there's a mirror. And if I look in the mirror, I'm able to see a reflection of my wounds and of the things that are being shown to me, right? And so then the next stage is sort of like this place of where we go into a bit of remorse and a bit of acceptance and more ownership, where we really start to take accountability. But it can be a challenging time. It's kind of like dark night of the soul, because all of a sudden we're like, wow, I'm responsible for my mind and I'm responsible for how my relationships go. Does that mean that I'm a terrible person? Did I do all of this? And that's not what's happening. But it can feel like that. It can feel like all of a sudden you are a wrecking ball. And everything is your fault. But it's really a beautiful time too, because you're finally getting to that place of self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
And then the final stage is illumination, which is, essentially we're talking about being enlightened in some way, which most of us never get to that point. But we can have moments of illumination. We can have moments of opening in our relationships and in our time with ourselves, where we have a moment where we could react or we could project, but instead we go in and we take accountability. And then instead of making ourselves wrong or beating ourselves up for it, we just soften. And those are the moments of illumination that we go for. And that's where conscious relationship takes us, is through those stages. But it's painful to get there. It's really not that fun. And so that's why most of us don't want to do it until we hit this really painful moment in our lives where we're forced into it. Like, I was forced into it. I didn't choose it. It just got thrown at me. And I was like, okay, I never want to feel this much pain again. Time for me to wake up.
Wow. I'm so glad. I'm so glad you're saying, this is medicine for me today, because I feel like this is very current. Like, I feel like a wrecking ball. I feel like I don't even know what, ever I thought love was. I don't know what any of the things I've been doing were, because they're all wrapped up in these stories that I'm realizing, and these patterns that I realizing I've just been puppeteering my whole life with.
Yeah.
And it's definitely a dark night of the soul situation where you go through periods of pain, again, that weave through my hormonal cycle, which we'll get into in a little bit. So I'm sure you have more to say on that. That's really beautiful, though. Thank you I really needed to hear that today. I was also wondering, the levels of mind, is there any foundation where that comes from? Or is that a system you guys put together yourself?
Yeah. So we worked with a spiritual teacher for about 4.5, 5 years. He's still, my husband still works with him in his men's groups, and he sort of created that. It's adapted from A Course in Miracles, which is, if you've heard of Course in Miracles, it's, very, very deep teachings.
Dense. Yeah.
Yeah. Very dense. You get through a page a night and you're good. And so it's sort of adapted from that. And so a lot of the things that we teach do come from a lineage that we were trained in and that we were actually initiated into by our teacher. And it stems from sort of a blend of Course in Miracles and depth psychology and Jungian psychology and shadow work and some esoteric teachings, all kind of blended into one.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love those steps. That's beautiful stuff. We were going to ask you too about your self-esteem dipping while we do shadow work, but I guess that ties to the idea there about the dark night of the soul situation, where you just feel like shit for a while because you're sorting through.
Yeah. You do feel like shit for a while. And oh my gosh, I remember going through this to the point where I just didn't think anything mattered. And I felt like my self-esteem had just completely plummeted. And I didn't want to do the work anymore because I just felt so terrible about myself. But we don't actually need to go that far. I think that, I immersed myself in pretty wild group therapy containers. And we were doing like 10 hours a week of this stuff for 4 years. But what I like to do is remind people that this is a practice of self-love and self-compassion, and it's not about judgment and it's not about blame. And so in our programs, we're really designing softer approaches so that we can do shadow work in a way that also nurtures us, so that we can do shadow work in a way that also reinforces why that is there, how it's been valuable, or how it's served us. Yeah. Because what we just forget is, like, even at our worst, we were responding to something in our environment or some threat that we felt we needed to defend against.
Yeah, we were doing our very best even in those moments because of our domestications.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for that again. So I got to listen back to this 20 times, let that sink in and integrate. I've heard you speak about intuition before, and you beautifully described probably the most critical part, and that is how we create the ability to trust our intuition by doing this inner work. Can you talk about how intuition and inner work are related?
Yeah, I think a lot of times when we're doing the work, we've lost connection to our bodies. We've lost connection to that inner voice, because there have been so many times where we ignored it, or there have been so many times where we were coming from judgment and it wasn't real. And so in the beginning, intuition is actually pretty hard to trust. My teacher used to say, intuition is for the birds. And I would be like, what are you talking about? Like, intuition is sacred. How could you say that? But I do understand what he was saying when he was saying that, because if we are full of stories, I'm not good enough, they're not good enough, we're always comparing, we're always criticizing as a way to distance ourselves from love.
Yeah.
We're like, I've suffered more than everyone, nobody could possibly understand me, or that person's bad, because we don't trust, then chances are our intuition is not actually intuition, it's fear. And so intuition is usually, it's like an inner knowing, and it feels peaceful and it feels calm. Fear has a lot of story attached to it. Fear feels very mental. It's like busy in the mind.
Makes sense.
And so we have to be willing to question ourselves for a while and really inquire with our minds. Like, am I making up a story? Is this my ego trying to keep me separate? Because the intuition isn't meant for that. And I think intuition can be a really sacred part of us that's like an inner knowing, but it's really loving.
Yeah, I feel like right now, again, that's a piece of what we were talking about just before, is being able to trust yourself is part of doing enough inner work and sorting through the shadows enough to know that this isn't fear. Okay, I can recognize the difference between reactive and responsive. All these pieces kind of fit together in that and create the intuition, the flow you're talking about. Yeah.
How do we begin to define our own boundaries if we've been someone who often failed to create or hold any?
So there's usually two types of people who have really, really intense boundaries that are almost like walls. You can't get in at all. They're not really boundaries, they're walls. And then we have the other side of that, which is what you're speaking to, which is virtually no boundaries. And generally we come from backgrounds where we had to caretake others, or our feelings were dismissed a lot, or we just weren't allowed to really prioritize ourselves in any way. And so developing boundaries is more than just writing out a list of things that we want or that we don't want and then saying them. We have to also feel that. And I believe that in order to feel that, we also need to know what's behind the fear. Why are we not setting boundaries in the first place? And sometimes what we'll discover is, I'm not setting boundaries because I'm afraid to lose love. I'm not setting boundaries because I'm terrified that if I do, I might die. There are some deep primal fears behind not setting boundaries, right? And so even though that might sound totally drastic and someone's like, oh yeah, right, like fear of death, are you kidding me? For real, it's there. And if you really tap in when you're at that pivotal point where you have to set a boundary with somebody who you love so much, but they're hurting you, there could be this primal fear of death. Because if you think about it, when you were little, even if your caretakers crossed your boundaries or you couldn't trust them, you had to override that to survive.
Right.
And that comes back again and again in romantic relationships. So I really think that it's a really beautiful process of coming home to our bodies again. And I always love raving about somatic experiencing work, because that is how I've rebuilt my own internal boundary system. For me, it's been about sort of taking the walls down a little, because I'm
What is that? The somatic experiencing?
Somatic experiencing is a system designed by Peter Levine, and he's a trauma expert and a legend. And he discovered ways of working with and repatterning the nervous system after trauma. And so it is a way of rewiring your nervous system. There are trauma therapists out there who are experienced somatic experiencing practitioners. And it does involve, different ways of just coming into your body and grounding, but it also can be table work where they're working with your adrenals or your kidneys. And it's changed my life. And so I love recommending that, because in my opinion, if we're not working with the body as well, we can't actually get the results that we want, because sometimes our responses are so deeply wired into our nervous system. So taking a look at that, and then also just gentle practices of like coming home to your body every day and doing body scans, checking in with your body, and then really feeling into the fear and remembering that when that fear comes up, you can have a conversation with yourself, right? So if the fear of setting the boundary is like, I'm going to lose love, then you can have a conversation with yourself about that. And you can remind yourself that, you are lovable, and that it is okay to set a boundary. And you can trust that if the person in your life can't respect your boundary or doesn't want to be in your life, if they can't walk all over your boundaries, then that's not really a healthy relationship to start with. But it takes having a self-esteem and a foundation of self-worth, and also knowing that it's okay to set those boundaries in order to do it and really stick with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Something you said there stuck out to me, and that was that we can have a core wound or energy or egoic tie that makes it feel like that literally death is, we're on the verge of death, or we're so endangered that's how we feel. And I have this reoccurring idea that the fear of abandonment, which all of us have to some degree. We all, we all cried when our mothers first set us down, right? We all cried when we left for the first day of school and we weren't with our mommies or whatever. I have this idea that the ego sees abandonment in any form essentially as not being validated. So your existence is not being validated at any time when someone is deciding not to be around you anymore, or your mother has to leave you to go to school or leave you with a foster family or whatever it is. And that essentially is your ego afraid that means you will die, right? Like the fear of death is essentially just the fear of abandonment, the ultimate abandonment, the abandonment of when we leave our bodies in the same sense. So I don't know if that's worth even bringing up here. It just feels like for anyone wondering how we could have gone from talking about, boundaries to creating this idea of actually we fear death. And that's what's the ultimate cause of all this. It can be that dramatic because at the base level, our ego is only working on very black and white dramatic formula. There's only these certain things that it works off of, and it all ties back down to really core basic fears like death.
And we're gonna die. We are.
Yeah.
I'm gonna die, you're gonna die. We don't know what. And so we create a lot of distractions and we create a lot of ways to forget about that.
Yeah.
And I like to be in relationship with death. And I know that might sound strange, but it's with me every day because I never know what moment's going to be my last. And so that's also inspiration to do the work.
Absolutely. I think that that's a really good therapy in itself, is we talk about thinking from your deathbed head, like just sitting for 5 minutes and thinking about what would it be like, or what if I died in 5 years, what would matter to me that I'm doing right now, or would this thing I'm stressed out about matter at all?